Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, quick question. How often do you really consider the price of tulips? I guarantee you it's not a trick question. It's an honest question. How often do you honestly think about that? Which leads you to other questions, such as, how often do you think about the price of morning glories, roses, gladiolas? There's a whole host of plants out there, usually purchasable at your local Home Depot or Lowe's, or sometimes even a Walmart. There's usually an outdoor section where you have plants absolutely everywhere, and they cost. Like, this isn't anything new. Immediately, the little person on my shoulder pops up and goes, duh, dude, yeah, they cost something. Everything costs something. Not even libraries are free. I know that because I work in one. Everything costs something. But ultimately, how much something costs is culturally and societally defined by a whole host of market factors. Now, what does tulips have to do with comics? Well, honestly, it didn't seem at first like there was going to be any direct correlation between that, and in fact, the only reason I'm bringing that up is because it's what today's topic is. But before I get into that topic, I also want to ask a couple of other questions. Have you ever heard of the Great Tulip Bust? Or maybe another visual element might help you kind of understand where I'm going towards. Do you know what this is? You probably do. They were pretty popular all but a couple years ago. You put them in your hand like this. You do all sorts of tricks with them. I'm pretty competent with mine. But what is this? And why is it important? Here's another question. What is this? And what is it worth? I'm sure it's worth something, because I had to pay about $10 to go see a movie in order to get it. Maybe this will help you out. Okay. These are some cute visual cues. I'm trying to be clever and interesting, but that's because the topic of today's video isn't necessarily an examination of just the medium of comics, but at the same time it is, because any medium is typically some manner of art. It's something human beings create to enhance our lives, to interact with. The reason we create television shows is because we want to be entertained. We want to, after a long, hard day at work, come home, turn on the TV, and watch some Game of Thrones, some Pokemon, some Avatar: The Last Airbender. We have shows in order to entertain us and just get us out of our world for a few moments so we can just passively enjoy an experience. We have movies. We have sculptures. These are avenues of expression which give people some kind of release from the mundanity of day-to-day life. And as this comic is dedicated, we have comic books, and comic books are really cool. They're a medium which help us escape our reality or sometimes help us reassess our reality. But at the same time, they're art, which means somebody has to make it and then somebody has to sell it. And that then brings me back to tulips. Because several years ago, I was having coffee with a friend of mine at Barnes & Noble, my local Barnes & Noble here in town. They've got a really, really nice cafe. And then once we were done with coffee, I decided to just kind of window shop for a little bit. And on one of the new book displays, there was this gorgeous book right here, A View from the Cheap Seats by Neil Gaiman. Now, all I had to see was the name Neil Gaiman, and immediately I just went, hello. I immediately picked the book up, opened it up, and went to the view of, looked to the contents page, and the very first essay or speech was, Why Our Future Depends on Libraries, Reading, and Daydreaming, the Reading Agency Lecture 2013. Naturally, I left the Barnes & Noble that day with a copy of this book, because a hardback Neil Gaiman was already a solid sell, but the fact that at the time I was desperately trying to get a job at my local public library, because I've always loved libraries, and Neil Gaiman had written a book that began with libraries, I was set. Now, I read the book, I fell in love with it, and now I work at a library. I'm really happy that I get to work at a library. There's a lot of other good essays in this collection, whether it's about musical artists that he appreciated, visual artists that he appreciated, or even just interesting events from his life. This is a really interesting collection. But there's one speech in this book that, try as I did, I couldn't really find anybody to... There might be some movement in the background. I think the mailman is here, so my dog Sonia might bark pretty soon. There she goes. Actually, I'm going to pause it while she's barking at the mailman. Be right back. I'm back. It actually wasn't the mailman. It was a couple kids in my neighborhood who wanted to mow my lawn for $20. So you might actually hear some noise in the background. Where was I? Oh, yes. Comics and commodities, commerce, what have you. Comics isn't necessarily immune to the effects of commerce, and Neil Gaiman actually made a speech directly to comics retailers in the 1990s that more or less touched on this topic. Now, this is really important because during the 1990s, the comics industry suffered a massive bubble burst. It was a crash in the market, which means that all at once, comics were viewed as a high-priced commodity, and then, like that, comics dropped significantly in price because of a whole host of factors that's way too complicated to get into here, partly because I don't have all the details, and also, two, my local comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics, actually has a 2-part video series that goes from beginning to end of this boom and bust. I'm going to post links in the description section below. Go ahead, pause this video, go and watch it, because Dave, the owner of Ground Zero Comics, does an amazing job at showing you just how crazy this bust was. Okay, so pause now, I'll wait. Need to clean in here. Okay, you're back. So, did you watch the video? Holy crap, that was nuts, right? But still, the 1990s was at first, wonderful time for comics, and then all too quickly, a horrible time for comics. And as that video really got into you, there were a whole host of reasons why. Part of it was because there was a lot of underappreciation of the art form of comics. Now again, there's a whole host of other reasons why it went bust, but nevertheless, it went bust because the production companies behind comics stopped caring about the quality of comics. Which leads me back to Neil Gaiman, because in 1993, he gave a speech to the Diamond retailers, the Diamond Comics 10th Annual Retail Seminar. I can't find a video of this speech. I tried, I can't find it. It's very unlikely that it was actually filmed. Speeches like this, usually they'll get a keynote speaker, but they won't necessarily record it because, well, again, stuff like that, who cares, right? And as far as I can tell, nobody online has really touched on this speech as well, which sucks because this is a really important speech to talk about. Neil Gaiman begins on the note of, I want to talk about comics. I want to talk about good comics and why you should do what you can to sell more of them. But first, I want to talk about Tulips. The speech begins with him talking about a book, Extraordinarily Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. It's a book which goes into a lot of different instances in which human beings have done wild, ridiculous, stupid things and then paid the consequence for it. TLDR, the Dutch during the, 1600s became obsessed with tulips. They were an import from the Far East, I believe originally from China, and the Dutch just lost their minds for tulips. And Gaiman quotes the book directly. The first tulips in Western Europe arrived from the East in the late 16th century and became very popular in Holland. In 1634, the rage among the Dutch to possess them was so great that the ordinary industry of the country was neglected, and the population, even to the lowest dregs, embarked on the tulip trade. As the mania increased, prices augmented until, in the year 1635, it became necessary to sell them by their weight in parrots, a small weight less than a grain. One tulip bulb sold for 12 acres of prime building land in Haarlem. Another sold for 4,600 florins, about $10,000 in modern money, plus a new carriage, 2 gray horses, and a complete set of harnesses for said horses. A wealthy merchant once received a sailor who came with news and was rewarded with the gift of a smoked herring for his breakfast, and then a sailor who knew nothing of tulips also took with him something he thought to be an onion, which, when he returned to his ship, he sliced and ate. He had eaten a 3,000 florin tulip bulb and spent some time in prison. Now, hopefully, you're like me. You hear that and go, tulips? Tulips? Like, for real? Like, Tulips? But yes, this was a real noted historical event, and the entire economy of Holland became indelibly ingrained with tulips and tulip bulbs. He continues on page 231 of this book. The tulip jobbers speculated in the rise and fall of tulip stocks and made large profits by buying when prices fell and selling out when they rose. Many individuals grew suddenly rich. A golden bait hung temptingly out before the people, and one after the other they rushed to the tulip marts, like flies around a honey pot. Everyone imagined that the passion for tulips would last forever, and that the wealthy from every part of the world would send to Holland and pay whatever prices were asked for them. To wit, the riches of Europe would be concentrated on the shores of the Zuider Zee, and poverty banished from the favored clime of Holland. Nobles, citizens, farmers, mechanics, seamen, footmen, maidservants, even chimney sweeps' old clothes dabbled in tulips. People of all grades converted their property into cash and invested it in flowers. Houses and lands were offered for sale at ruinously low prices. You could probably guess what happened next. Holland approached the world with this high-priced commodity and went, look at the tulip, look how much we've invested in it. Surely you want to invest in it as well. To which case, everyone in Europe went, darling, are you okay? Holland crashed. The tulip price sank. And millions of people lost millions of dollars in money, and some people lost their entire livelihood and were effectively ruined. It was a huge crash because, again, people put their money in this commodity rather than any other type of typical financial venture which other people could appreciate. What does that have to do with fidget spinners? What does that have to do with Pokemon cards? What does that have to do with comics? And more importantly, what does that have to do with us today? The comic book crash of 1994 is something that happened in the past. But is it, though? Think about how culturally predominant comics are in today's media. Think about how much money Avengers Endgame made in the last year. Think about how many superhero movies are continually in the works. Think about the fact that there's a new Batman movie that is coming out, and how in 1989 the first Batman movie made billions. I'd also ask you to consider this as well. The speculator market is not dead. It never truly dies. Whether it's baseball cards, fidget spinners, Pogs, Pokemon cards, comic books, what have you, there's always people out there who look at something and goes, hey, this will probably be worth something in the future. And this is true whether it's action figures, fidget spinners, Pokemon cards, Beanie Babies, what have you. And sometimes these people can make a lot of money, but other times they don't. And I think back immediately to the focus of this channel, which is understanding the medium of comics and my own love of the medium. And I wanted to show you one or two little examples of why I feel this is really important and necessary. Now, in my collection, right to the right of me, I'll pick my tripod up and show you, you can see I have a whole host of Neil Gaiman books. This is where all of my Neil Gaiman rests at all times. Whether it's my autographed copy of Norse mythology, whether it's my copy of American Gods, whether it's all of my Sandman books, or even just some single issues. If it's Neil Gaiman, I get it. Because I love Neil Gaiman, I love his approach to stories, I love the way he looks at stories. But also, inside of that collection are a couple of single issues that I want to show you. This is Sandman 1-1, aka Volume 1, Number 1. Immediately, some people are going to go, whoa! But a very crucial detail here is right here. This is an essential Vertigo label. This means this is effectively a reprinting of Volume 1, Number 1 of Sandman, Neil Gaiman's comic epic, and a book which I have every intention of covering in depth on this channel in the future. But this is important because at first it seems like Sandman 1, Number 1, that has got to be worth something. But then you looked at the fact that it's a reprint rather than an air quote original, and immediately that price goes down. In fact, right down here on the bottom, it says this book sells in America for about $1.95. I seriously doubt I could even get $2 for this comic book in an average market. Whereas this comic book here, which is another Sandman book, this is Sandman number 19, specifically Dream Country, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, if that doesn't immediately resonate with you, I guarantee you 30 or 40 comic book fans and 30 or 40 literature fans just wet themselves, because this is the issue of Sandman where William Shakespeare's company actually premieres the play A Midsummer Night's Dream and performs it in front of the original fairy folk who inspired the play. This is a massive, crucial, and arguably one of the most beautiful stories you will ever read in your life. This comic is really hard to track down, and as you can see by this little price sticker, I paid close to about 40 bucks for it. I paid 40 bucks for it because it's a Sandman book, it's one of my favorite Sandman books, and because I love Shakespeare. This was located in the rare bookcase of my local comic book shop. And before you think that this is my whole crux of my argument, wait just one more second and observe one more example. To my left, I have another comic. Recently, I went back to my parents' house where I've got 2 long boxes filled with individual issues that I just haven't had time to move over here to my house. And while I was looking through them, I pulled out a bunch of books that I was interested in rereading just for the sake of rereading them or because I wanted to talk about them here on this channel. One of them immediately caught my eye, and that was Harley Quinn number 1. This comic book could also be found in my local comic book shop, and this one could be sold for $50. I couldn't tell you what this story is about, if I remembered it. From what I recall, I think Harley gets an apartment, tries to set up her own agency, her own crew, what have you. It's very much in keeping with the animated series Harley Quinn, which is available on DC Stream, which I'm honestly kind of curious about. Partly because I like Kaylee Cuoco, but also because it looks really good. But this Harley Quinn, again, is worth $50, and I couldn't tell you what it's for, yet nevertheless, I've bagged and boxed it. Why? Well, because it might be worth something, but also because seeing that $50 really began to get me to think, is this really worth it? And when I was talking to my friend Michael, who's the co-manager of the store, he told me that book is really important because it's the first time we really saw Harley Quinn separate from the Joker. And if you don't know anything about the extensive Harley Quinn... That's my dog Sonia again. She's probably barking at the kids. They most likely took a break. If you don't know anything about the Harley Quinn-Joker dynamic, she's gone off on her own and essentially become her own character. She's no longer Joker's sidekick. So this is kind of an event in the long trajectory of the DC universe. And so what's happened is there's a great number of speculators out there that have taken that fact about the comic and gone, huh, you know, that might be worth something. That might be worth a lot, actually. To which case, I immediately go back to Tulips. Comic book retailers across this country are hurting right now, and they're hurting bad. This is largely because comics have had kind of a rough decade. Not as near as bad, some would argue, say, as like the 1950s when Dr. Wortham created the whole comic scare. Not as bad as the 1970s when comics was kind of confused about what it was trying to do. But nevertheless, retailers are hurting. Predominantly because a lot of online shopping, predominantly because a lot of people will come into their shops, take a photo of a book, leave, and then buy it on Amazon, and then also because of a devaluation of comics, and then, far more importantly, because of crap like this. People will go into comic shops, comb the individual issue section, and buy comics because Harley Quinn number 1 was the first appearance of Harley, so they can immediately buy it for $3, go to Etsy or eBay, sell it for $50, and make a fortune. People are turning comics into a hot commodity. We'll get to the but right after this. Okay. But, as my viewer will immediately argue, who cares? Comics have always been wrapped up in commerce. The very fact that we have comic books is a fundamental aspect of commerce. People began to want to read the adventures of these caped crusaders, what have you, in the form of comic books. They wanted to pay for it. So who cares if comic retailers are getting screwed? This is just the nature of the business. And to that I say, dude, at least a fraction of empathy, or at least the appearance of empathy. Come on. But it's a hard argument to fight against, and I don't really have necessarily a good argument for it, at least at first, because yes, comics have always been a part of capitalism, and capitalism ultimately right now is the most fundamental system we have. And I don't want to be yet another in a long line of people decrying capitalism and saying it's bad and that we need to move over to socialism. I'm not. All this video is about the devaluation of comics and the comics market. Because right now, it's easy to just say, well, this is just the system, sometimes people get screwed. But long term, we have an issue. It's not just that people are going to get screwed, we're also going to see a devaluation of a really important medium. Because it's not necessarily just the fact that a couple of people are going to lose their job. It's the fact that there's a great number of people who come to comics because they love them, heart and soul. Weirdos like me love comics, not just superhero comics. The whole library around you is a dedication to the idea that comics is a really interesting medium because you can do anything with it. And if the speculation market continues, there's going to be even more harm done to an individual comic retailer's outlet, in which case then it's going to become more and more difficult for people to get access to comic books. Which, fun fact, Neil Gaiman talked about in his speech, because as he points out, in 1986 he was writing an article for a local newspaper about comics, and when he eventually submitted the article to his publisher, nothing happened. And he eventually talked to the publisher. He's like, hey, what happened to the article? And he says on page 233, so after a couple of weeks I rang him up. He sounded oddly subdued. How's the article, I asked. He told me that he had a problem or two with it. I suggested that he tell me what the problem was. I could rewrite it, get it better. Well, he said, it lacks balance. In what way? These comics, he paused, then spat it out. You seem to think they're a good thing. The nerd in me is just so triggered right now. But it's an important argument to have because I've addressed it over and over again. And if I can go back to this lovely collection here, when Superman first made his appearance, he created a new market. Because before him, the superhero comic was just something of an experiment. It wasn't a staple of the society at that point. But as soon as we saw the very first issue of Action Comics with Superman throwing that green car into the rock and everybody running away, people began to go, huh, that's kind of cool. I want to read that. And then somebody realized, if people want to read this, maybe we could make an industry out of this. And thus, on the backs of dreams and creativity, new markets were created. Again, this is really important because when we're talking about art, yes, commerce is very much a determining factor, and the history of art and commerce has got a whole lecture series unto itself. But when devaluation occurs, it becomes easy for that market to be manipulated. And when markets are manipulated, bad things can happen and a lot of people can get hurt. Case in point with the Tulips. In 1993, people were buying a lot of Tulips. They were throwing out a lot of comics. And they were throwing out a lot of bad and forgettable comics. Again, since you watched that video by my friend Dave, you know some of those books were absolute travesties of construction and composition. They were just blatant attempts at making a couple of bucks off the backs of people who just wanted to read some fun comics. And on page 235, Neil Gaiman talks about that. Someone wisely asked me what I meant by the good stuff, and I told them, and someone else asked me what I meant by pushing it, and I told them, as I will tell you. What I mean by the good stuff is comics you enjoy. If you yourself have stopped reading comics, and sad to say many retailers have, there's too much out there. Or one way they found they no longer enjoyed West Coast Avengers and gave up on the whole field, disillusioned, then browse around. Ask friends, ask your staff, ask your customers. But most of you have comics you like, and you should be pushing them. How? It doesn't involve much. For example, you can put a rack near the door of things you're proud of selling. You can order just a few more copies of things you think are really good and try to sell them. You could offer a money-back guarantee to anyone buying something you have faith in. It's not a hard thing to do. Pick a comic of the week and push it. Suggest to customers who don't read what they buy that maybe they should read these things instead of just bagging them. Try to familiarize yourself with what's out there and let your tastes influence your customers. He continues on to the next page and notes, I'm really just asking you to think of comics as reading material. Think of comics as an entertainment. Think of comics as stories. You aren't selling investment items. You're selling dreams. Never forget that. Okay. That's everything. And I am unapologetic in the fact that I stand by the medium of comics, not because I think there's going to be any long-term investment in them. These are books printed on paper. By their very existence, they're going to break. They're going to burn. They're going to deteriorate. This $150 omnibus of Jack Kirby's Fourth World epic is not an investment. I didn't buy it because I thought this huge book, which is already throwing at my back trying to hold it up, was going to make me a lot of money. Nor, when I bought this collection of Action Comics originals, I spent $80 on it. I didn't buy this because I thought it would increase in price. It's not. This is like a car. The moment you buy it and take it off the lot, it's going to depreciate in value. Likewise, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a comic book. No matter how much plastic I wrap it in, no matter how many fancy frames that I put it in that block UV rays and gamma rays and what have you, this book is deteriorating. It's breaking down. It's just the nature of the artwork. So I paid $40 essentially for something that's ultimately going to fall apart someday in the future or simply just not exist. But that's not the point. I bought this book because I love this story. I love this dream. And every single time I sit down and then read it, and I read the closing pages where Puck delivers his final soliloquy, it brings me joy. A couple weeks back, I was in Ground Zero Comics, my hometown comic shop, and I was buying a big stack of graphic novels. Surprise, surprise. It was right before COVID-19 happened and all this pandemic stuff happened. I realized I probably wasn't going to be able to get into the shop anytime soon, so I decided to just buy a big stack of comics. And I was talking with the owner, Dave, about it, and we were discussing these splurge purchases and why we purchase things. Because he loves vinyl records like I do. It's something we mutually talk about sometimes. And he told me his mother had an expression. You are spending money without the expectation of getting it back. Because you're not purchasing an investment. If I wanted to invest in something, I would invest in stocks, I would invest in bonds, I would invest in companies, what have you. Those are things that I know, based upon the real market, are going to grow. Or not. Sometimes when you put investments in things, sometimes you lose. That's why when I approach art, I don't look at an investment in terms of solid financial backing. I look at something that, as his mother once said, you're feeding your soul. It brings you joy. And I realize now I'm probably just waxing philosophic about narrative and spirituality and just the joy of art. But I really do stand by the fact that if you're going to take the time and effort to track down a copy of Midsummer Night's Dream, or even this book, which I do intend to talk about sometime in the future, Hellblazer number 27, a book which is damn near impossible to track down, you're hopefully purchasing this not because you think, hey, this thing is going to put my kid through college. You're purchasing it because I love the Hellblazer series, or I love Neil Gaiman, or I love Dave McKean, or hell, I just really love reading comics. And this is a comic that's hard to find. I want to read it. A lot of people in the 1990s flooded the market with bad comics, thinking that they would become long-term investments. And now they're in almost every bargain bin in the back of every comic book shop that's left in the United States. Right now, the comics market is flooded with speculation. It's flooded with a lot of dreams that a lot of these superhero movies are going to raise the price of comics and make a lot of people rich. But again, these aren't investment items. And there's evidence enough already that people are starting to get worn out from this mess. And so I'm not trying to be a doomsayer. I hate negative messages. This video is just me attempting to communicate to you, my viewer, who hopefully loves comics the way that I do, is that this is more just a video made out of concern and hopefully some manner of plea. Comics as a medium is about the stories you're trying to tell, and not about making money. And as Neil Gaiman notes on page 237, the very close of his essay, a speech I gave at Diamond Comic Distributors' 10th Annual Retailers Seminar, April 1993. Delivered to a room filled with comics retailers at the statistical height of the bubble. It was barely applauded by a room filled with otherwise happy people, and I heard later that a lot of the retailers thought it was in bad taste, which was a pity, because a year later, the world of comics entered a recession it took almost a decade to get out of, and most of those people lost their livelihoods and their stores over the next few years. It gave me no pleasure to be right. I don't want to be right. I really hope I'm wrong, and that this video will age horribly, and that 20 years from now, comics will be in one of the best places in the world, and nobody will be out of a job, and that comics retailer markets have just skyrocketed. But it doesn't look like that's what's happening. It looks like we're getting ready for yet another in a series of recessions. And the way the economy is going, I don't really see it getting better. So hopefully, if I'm reaching anybody with this video, I hope you can see what I'm trying to say. I have a Harley Quinn #1. I paid $4 for it. Now it's worth $50. I'm probably never going to read this story ever again. And honestly, I'm probably never going to sell this comic book for that level of money. Because how could I? What I can tell you is this $50 copy of Hellblazer #27 and this $40 copy of Sandman Dream Country, A Midsummer Night's Dream, will remain in my library for as long as my heart remains beating. Because this is a dream that was worth it. Alright, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for indulging me. This video, I promise the next video is going to be about an actual comic book. Speaking of Neil Gaiman, we've actually got our first Neil Gaiman coming up. I'm super stoked about it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're liking these videos, and that, one, that you're actually watching them, but two, that you enjoy this. And again, as always, if you have suggestions for comics, or just you like the video and you want to say, hey, I think you're cool, or hey, get a shave, I'll take anything. I'm easy. Just leave me a comment below. And of course, if you didn't watch the video from Ground Zero Comics, shame on you. But it's still in the description section below. Check them out. The channel is amazing. I love Dave so much, and the story of the 1994 comics crash is worth your time. Even if you're not a comics fan, it's simply an amazing, interesting story. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.